Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we've got a really fascinating source lined up. Our goal, like always, is to dig in and pull out those, nuggets of insight that help make sense of things. The source this time, it's a transcript from YouTube. The channel is Jesnovidzi Krzysztof Jackowski Official, and the video title translates to something like "Verified Vision: Israel Attacked Ports Vision Live."
Yeah, and it's quite a ride. We're going to be jumping between some really diverse topics. Think geopolitics, the nature of time itself, even climate observations and how ready society might be for, well, for certain events, all from this one source.
Exactly. It's a real mix. So you should expect some maybe surprising angles, things that might challenge how you usually see things. Hopefully it's a quick way to get up to speed on some pretty complex stuff and what might be going on underneath. Let's get into it. Okay, so right off the bat, the source mentions confirmed predictions, something about an Israeli attack. What was that specifically, and what's the kind of bigger picture idea there?
Well, what's really interesting is the claim itself. The source says a prediction about Israel attacking a port, an air attack, was verified. It points to news outlets, like Virtualna Polska, apparently, reporting Israel hitting targets in Yemen, specifically mentioning 3 seaports and a power plant targeting Houthi rebels.
Okay.
But the main point here, I think, isn't just was the prediction right or wrong. It's more about the way this kind of, critical geopolitical information might actually come out. It sort of challenges the idea that we only get reliable info from, say, official government briefings or mainstream news. It hints at other channels, maybe unconventional ones.
That's a really good point about information sources. And it seems the geopolitics discussion keeps going. The source then connects Polish politics to these bigger international alliances. What's the main thrust of that argument over the Poland's future?
It basically paints 2 potential paths for Poland, heavily dependent on who's leading. If the current leader, Tusk, stays, the alignment is seen as leaning towards Germany, towards the EU. But if the Peace Party were to return, especially with a different president perhaps, the direction supposedly shifts dramatically. Poland would look much more towards the United States, taking cues from there. The source even mentions Trump's perceived strategy, seeing Poland as part of a front bloc, not necessarily for immediate conflict, but as a sort of prepositioned military force, alongside Lithuania, Latvia, maybe even Finland.
A front block. So less about fighting right now, more like being strategically ready.
Exactly, positioned. And that leads into this other really intriguing concept mentioned, a second NATO structure. That sounds pretty significant, like rethinking the whole alliance setup.
Yeah, what is that about?
Well, the source floats this idea that Trump might propose, and it suggests this would be accepted a kind of parallel NATO, not replacing the main defensive alliance we know, but adding a second layer, maybe more agile, involving only, quote, capable states, like the US, UK, France.
Capable states.
And the implication isn't just bureaucratic shuffling. The real insight, I think, is that setting up something like this signals a major shift in thinking about alliances, moving maybe beyond just deterrence to something more assertive, a rapid response capability that could potentially allow for preemptive action. It could really change the global security game.
A more proactive, faster arm of NATO.
Okay. And sticking with readiness, the source mentions Poland's borders and Ukraine. How does that fit into this picture?
Right, so it claims that as of early July, Poland's borders are under full control, even though they're in the Schengen area, which usually means open borders. This is presented as something unusual, not just standard procedure. It mentions Germany, for instance, having heavily staffed its border with Poland for almost 2 years, supposedly anticipating a huge wave of refugees out of Ukraine.
So these border measures are seen as planning ahead, kind of preemptive moves, yeah, part of a bigger strategic picture that's unfolding. The source even suggests that if the current Polish government were to collapse, Poland would be quickly ready for potential actions related to Ukraine, becoming the starting point for that block we talked about. It's all about seeing these moves as anticipating future events, like mass migrations or deeper involvement, way before they actually happen.
That definitely suggests a region on edge. And the source gets even more specific, predicting incidents near the border.
Right.
Like in Brest.
Yeah, it does. It foretells a, quote, very serious border incident in Brest, Belarus, supposedly on the 29th of some month.
Right.
It talks about an exchange of fire between border guards, not necessarily sparking a full war, but a major incident nonetheless.
Okay.
And there's more. It predicts a critical situation within Ukraine, too, involving a false alarm of danger that would cause massive panic and displacement affecting neighboring countries, including Poland, plus an attack on oil infrastructure, maybe extraction facilities, possibly in western Poland or a neighboring country. The insight here seems to be focused on these specific, localized events that could act as triggers, seriously destabilizing things even if they don't immediately lead to all-out war.
Okay, so these massive geopolitical shifts, potential conflicts, national readiness, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But then the source takes this really sharp turn, doesn't it? Away from global strategy to something incredibly personal, time.
Yeah.
It talks about how time feels like it's speeding up. What's the idea there?
Yeah, it's quite a pivot. And this is where it gets very relatable, I think. Many people do feel like time is just flying by, but the source is very clear. Time itself, objectively, hasn't changed. A minute is still 60 seconds. What has changed, according to this view, is our perception of it. Our minds are just constantly processing so much more information. The pace of life is faster, and this creates an illusion that time itself is accelerating. The key insight is that our subjective feeling of time is really tied to our mental state, to this constant information flood we're living in.
So it's not the clock, it's us.
Yeah.
It's our brains trying to keep up with everything. The source used some analogies, right?
Yeah.
To explain this perception thing.
It did, and they're quite good. Like, imagine you've got a flight tomorrow morning, say 10 a.m., going somewhere exciting like Brazil, maybe first time flying, that night beforehand. Because you're anxious, excited, can't sleep, it feels incredibly long, like 2 nights crammed into one. Your consciousness is sort of stretching the time out.
Okay, I can see that.
Then the opposite. You're at a party, a wedding maybe, dancing, talking, having fun. You glance at your watch, it's 1 a.m., blink again, it's 3 a.m. Suddenly it's nearly morning. Time just seems to disappear.
Yeah, that happens.
So the insight from these examples is how much our engagement and mental state can warp how we experience duration. High stimulation or anticipation can make time seem to compress or expand in our heads.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Explains those long work days versus weekends flying by.
Yeah.
So if this constant digital input, this information overload, is stealing our time, as the source puts it, what's the proposed solution? It sounds pretty drastic.
It is pretty drastic. The source implies that technology, this endless stream of information, is essentially robbing us of time because our minds never get a break. There's no empty space to just pause, reflect, or exist. And the advice given is quite blunt. Those who want to live longer should put a big barrier on the internet and use it very rarely.
Wow, okay, a big barrier.
Yeah, it's not just maybe use it less. It's framed as a serious step to combat this feeling of being overwhelmed and losing time. The deeper point seems to be that reclaiming our sense of time, our own consciousness really, might mean fundamentally rethinking how much digital input we allow in our lives, viewing it almost as a cognitive drain. The speaker even sort of laments how much less leisure time they feel they have now compared to 10, 15 years ago. Like we're being systematically stripped of time by the constant rush.
That's definitely food for thought in our always-on world. Real warning. Okay, so from the abstract idea of time perception, let's switch again, this time to climate. Something very tangible. The source seems to have a pretty different take compared to a lot of what we hear.
Yes, it pushes back quite strongly against the narrative of, the planet being on fire, essentially. The argument is that we, or at least the speaker, live in a temperate climate zone. And while the media might highlight high temperatures showing those dark red maps for, say, 27 or 29 degrees Celsius, the source contends that days over 30 degrees were perfectly normal in the past. Nobody called it a catastrophe then. So the insight it's offering is really about historical context. It's asking us to question whether what's framed as exceptional heat today was actually just considered summer previously.
Right, recalibrating what normal means for this kind of climate.
Exactly. It emphasizes that in temperate zones, you expect hot spells in summer. You also expect thunderstorms, hail, sometimes floods. That's just part of the package, the charm of the climate, as the source puts it. It mentions the big flood in Rocco years ago, pointing out that happened before global warming was such a dominant topic, suggesting these extreme weather events aren't entirely new or abnormal for this type of climate. The underlying idea is that maybe we're over-interpreting natural weather variability, this capriciousness that comes with shifting seasons, through a lens of constant alarm.
Interesting. A perspective that definitely cuts against the grain of many headlines. Okay, and finally, let's touch on something you mentioned earlier, preparedness, specifically regarding blackouts. The source has a really unusual interpretation of recent power outages in Europe.
It does, and this ties back neatly to those geopolitical concerns we started with. The source looks at recent blackouts mentioning Prague, parts of the Czech Republic, Spain, Portugal, France, and suggests they weren't just technical failures or random incidents. It calls them preventative exercises carried out by state services.
Preventative exercises. Wow,
Uh,
that's a strong claim. Why would services be doing that?
The reasoning offered is pretty stark. The source believes Western countries are gearing up for the possibility of a total war. With perceived shifts in global power, like America's influence potentially waning, the risk of a major global conflict is seen as real.
Okay.
And in that kind of conflict, key infrastructure like power plants would likely be primary targets hit very early on. So these blackouts are viewed as essential real-world drills. Services are testing everything, how systems cope without power, how the population reacts, how to manage potential chaos, how to direct people when the lights go out.
So it's less about fixing a technical glitch and more about practicing for a worst-case scenario, learning how to maintain control.
That's the interpretation, yes. Practicing how society functions, or doesn't function, under that kind of extreme stress. Preparing for targeted attacks on critical infrastructure. The really sobering insight here is the suggestion that things we might see as random disruptions could actually be deliberate, large-scale rehearsals for a catastrophic future. It implies a level of state-level preparedness for conflict that we don't often talk about.
Understanding how to keep order when everything goes dark. That really is a sobering thought about the kind of planning defense services might be doing.
It is. The source describes these blackouts as very disturbing for precisely that reason. Because if this interpretation is right, they signal a genuine, practical preparation for a potential global conflict involving major powers, maybe Russia, Iran, China. It's a glimpse into some very serious contingency planning.
Wow. Well, that certainly was a deep dive, covering a lot of ground from just one source. We went from those verified geopolitical predictions like the attacks in Yemen, all the way to that really profound discussion about how we even perceive time in this, information-saturated age.
Yeah, and we didn't stop there, did we? We got into those contrasting views on climate, sort of pushing back on the planet-burning narrative.
Right.
And then landed on those pretty striking insights about global readiness, framing recent blackouts not as accidents, but potentially as these deliberate preventative exercises.
It really shows the sheer breadth of ideas you can find, sometimes in unexpected places, and how critically looking at different sources, even unconventional ones like this, can help connect dots or at least offer totally different perspectives on events.
Absolutely. It underlines the value of examining diverse viewpoints to try and understand the deeper currents, the underlying implications of what's happening.
So, as you, the listener, process all of this, what do you think about this? Considering everything we've touched on, the complexity of information, the global shifts, the potential conflicts, how might understanding this idea of the illusion of time speed or this concept of blackouts as preventive exercises maybe make you rethink things like your own daily pace or even your own level of personal preparedness?
It's definitely worth pondering which of these insights really stick with you, what resonates the most given everything going on.